Hi class, Dr. Weiss here. This is my first lecture for the second half of the argumentation course. It's a lecture on argument field theory. Before I get into that, I just want to make sure that everybody's okay and that everybody is comfortable with how we're going to proceed, not only in this class but my other classes, because I know a bunch of you are in multiple sections of mine. So I did post some stuff on Canvas about that, and I will be continuing to add material. You can go at your own pace and watch and learn when it's convenient for you. I think that's the best way to handle a situation like this. Please feel free to email me or text message me and let me know. And as far as the midterms concerned, I already posted this a couple times. Just get it into me whenever you can. And from this point on, I will make sure all the assignments that I post will have turn in on Canvas as an option. So you don't have to ask me about how to get it to me. And maybe we'll get through all this stuff and life will get back to normal. I just hope everybody's doing okay. And again, let me know if you need anything. All right, so let's get right into this. You remember in the first half of the semester, we learned what I would call the nuts and bolts and the applications of argument. We learned the principles of argumentation. We learned the terminology, the vocabulary, the definitions. We learned about responsibilities of arguers. We learned about judging and the different types of judgment. We learned about the mechanics of logic and reasoning and how that works into argument. And we learned about debate, which is an application of everything we had learned. So now we're going to do something that's really quite different. And I really love this part of the course because it gets into answering the question, so is argument just one thing or is it actually many things? And the answer is it's actually many things. Because as you go from inquiry to inquiry, from subject to subject, from field to field, you will see that argument is a very different thing, which leads me to discuss the idea of what's called argument field theory. Now, this is not something that I came up with, but my treatment of it and the way I present it, both in the textbook and here, is in fact my version of it. I had a friend years ago who came up with another version of this. She's now deceased, but hers was very good. And then Stephen Toulmin himself, who's the guy who came up with the theory that suggested this, also later came up with his own version. And I'll talk a little bit about his in a minute as well. So when we say argument field theory, what we're basically saying is that every argument takes place in a field. So there is no universal field of argument, but there are subfields for which all argument needs a place to take place. So what would be an example of why we have to have fields of argument? Well, I guess one of the best ways of looking at it would be to use an analogy or a metaphor. Let's say you liked opera. Okay, and you went to the opera and you noticed that everybody who was singing in the opera was not paying attention to what normally occurs in an opera. For example, if it's an Italian opera, they sing in Italian and they sing arias and they sing the arias that were written by the composer and they're acting out the story, etc., etc. So if you're watching, let's say, Madame Butterfly, and Madame Butterfly comes out there and she starts singing you know that old stupid song, Everybody Dance Now? You would say, well, wait a minute, I love that song, but it doesn't really fit here. Okay, and that's because in just the way music is divided up into genres, arguments are divided up into genres. There's different ways that we have argument, and they're fenced off from each other. Now, you can have an opera where somebody sings rock and roll, like Jesus Christ Superstar, but they actually wrote it that way. You didn't just start doing that or switch to that without any notice. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to define what the argument fields are, and I'm going to try to explain where they came from and why we use this approach. And then I'm going to give you some examples. So let's get started. So first of all, the fellow that's on this slide, this picture, as I already mentioned his name is Stephen Toulmin. You might have remembered we briefly talked about him when we were talking about syllogisms and enthymemes. We talked about there's a new alternative model of argument that was presented in the 20th century by a guy named Stephen Toulmin. It's called the Toulmin model of argument. That model came from this book, The Uses of Argument by Stephen Toulmin. This is a book that was written in the 1950s. The audience for this book were philosophers. Philosophers in the 1950s in England, where he taught, were not too fond of having ethical and political arguments. They were mostly worried about very technical arguments in philosophy having to do with language and logic. Toulmin wanted to be part of the group of philosophers who would change that trend. And so he published this book. The book was not an overwhelming success among his colleagues and in the philosophical community. But a group of people that did notice it were people in the United States that taught in my field, particularly people that taught argumentation and debate. They loved the Toulmin model because it suggested an alternative to the traditional way of teaching logic and reasoning via Aristotle. In the book, he briefly, just in glancing, mentioned the idea of perhaps something called argument fields. Never explained it, never went into it. And I did have a former friend, colleague who passed away, who wrote her whole doctoral dissertation trying to guess or discern or figure out what exactly Toulmin meant by that. She wrote that and published it. Years later, Toulmin came out with another book which started to hint at or suggest at what he meant by argument fields. He wrote this book in the 70s, The Human Understanding, the Collective Use and Evolution of Concepts. This is a very interesting book in which he talked about how, as human beings, we organize in different ways to learn and amass knowledge. This explains an institution like a university. In a university, we all have decided there's interesting subjects that we want to study, but not only do we separate the subjects from each other, we separate the way that each of those subjects makes claims, defends them, and what they'll accept as basically evidence or proof that a claim has been fulfilled. So we know, for example, that science is very different from history, which is very different from anthropology, which is very different from literature, which is very different from communication. And one of the things that attracts you to a field is not just the way that it teaches subject matters, but also the way that it makes its claims and defend them. So in other words, you have to both accept the method as well as the content in order to be interested in a field. Okay, so if you think, for example, that a field uses a method that's just BS, you're not going to be attracted to that field no matter what it says. And this is how we organize. This is how we organize our universities and all of our institutions that try to learn things. So in this book, without going into specifics about what argument fields were, he suggested an example of how one field would differ from another. So imagine, if you would, a pyramid or a triangle, and at the very top of the triangle, where it gets very narrow and comes to a point, he would put at the very top of that triangle a subject matter in a university like atomic physics. Atomic physics is very specific. It's very tight in its controls as an academic field. What you can and can't make as an argument in that field is pretty obvious. For example, you can't say in advancing a theory in a scientific field, I like this theory because it makes me feel good, right? Won't fly. Have to have some reason for the theory to be examined seriously. Experiments, formulas, tests, theories that can be examined by other people with similar training, background, and understanding, and can see the strengths and weaknesses of the arguments and make it open to criticism. At the very bottom of that same triangle at the base, you could put all the academic fields that are much looser in the way that they view their subject matters. For example, you could put literature and the arts, philosophy, history, what we usually call the humanities. They're no less significant or important in their intellectual content, but their methods for assessing what the people in the field accept is very different. So here's an example of that. When I was an undergraduate, like you are, I took an English course, and my professor was something called a new critic. New critics had very strict rules about how to criticize a piece of literature. So, for example, if you would ask a new critic, what was the author's intent in writing this book? The new critic would say, it's an absolutely irrelevant, inappropriate, and meaningless question for a critic. Because when an author creates a book, the book has its own life on its own, and what the book tells you has nothing to do with what the author intended in the first place. You learn nothing by trying to find out what the author intended. So, that's the way we were taught. These days, that's not the way we teach literature. It's very different, right? So, people in a field like that, they go with something like that. We call it a paradigm. And at some point they say, well, we don't like that anymore. Let's try something different. Let's look at something that's way more interesting to us. And then people generally agree with it. And you go with the new paradigm, the new model. So that's an interesting distinction. You have some fields where we shift the criteria. We have other fields where the criteria are rather rigid. And that's what creates their difference in method or type, but it doesn't tell you about their difference in content that differentiates them, which includes the method or type. So that's what I'm going to do today. And even though you can argue in any field, and even though argument is universal and takes place across lots of fields, you're never going to find a universal way of arguing for all fields. But what you will find are distinct fields that argue in different ways, which once you enumerate them and lay them out and spell them out, pretty much tell you everything you need to know about arguing. And surprisingly, even though we have so many different academic fields, so many different subject matters, we really only have 5 argument fields. It's kind of amazing when you think about it. I'll talk about what those are in a minute. Now, Toulmin himself actually at some point committed to what these argument fields are, but way after people like my former colleague and myself had already committed to our own view of that and written them down. And surprisingly, he had pretty much the same list. He had slightly different terminology and slightly different ways of describing them, but he had the same number and pretty much presented the same theory. So rather than teach you his theory, I'm going to teach you mine, which actually I kind of like a little better than his. I won't go into why. All right. So he presented his most complete version in this book, Introduction to Reasoning. And by the way, the 2 other authors on that book, Richard Ricci and Alan Janik, were not philosophers like Stephen Toulmin. They were communication professors at the University of Utah. They taught debate and argumentation. This book was sold in 2 editions. It was not a good seller because of its unique and different approach, but he did put it into an undergraduate text. So let's go ahead and learn what the fields are. The first field is jurisprudence. So what's jurisprudence? And that's a very fancy name for law. But we don't want to say law because we don't want you to think of this field as just being the field of law, that one type of argument is the law. We're talking about rather the model of argument that is used in the law as it applies to every context in which it's used. So what is jurisprudence? Jurisprudence, of course, is the theory, the rationale for legal reasoning and legal practice. And what is the underlying concept there? The underlying concept is a method which produces an outcome which is fair. The really big thing in jurisprudence is that you have a fair process. Like if you're on trial, right, and you go through the trial and then you realize at the end that the whole thing wasn't fair, you would say, well, that isn't really why I went to court, or that wasn't really why I went through the process of trying to defend myself or prove something. But anywhere in our society or in our world where we set up a process that's jurisprudential, we're basically saying we're willing to use the rules and the methods that are used in a court when it's done properly to adjudicate fairly a question and to have that question be answered in that same way that we answer a question in a trial. Okay? So one thing that comes to mind is like a grade appeal process. That's a jurisprudential process. So think about it. In that kind of process, the arguments would take place where you could have witnesses. You could cross-examine people who are accusing you of things. You could see the evidence that's being presented to you. You could present rules or regulations or codes of conduct that guide how the professor and the student are supposed to behave, right? And also the process is supposed to resolve with a decision that's rendered impartially and fairly, and the reasoning or the justification for the decision is supposed to be laid out in the process of having the argument. So that's a jurisprudential process. And it turns out that's one of the ways that we, as again, in a society like ours, that's one of the ways we argue, and quite a bit. We set up a lot of processes for argument as arguments that follow jurisprudential questions about justice, basically. Okay. Next, science. I already mentioned that when talking about the physicists, right? Science has its own rules for argument. Now, again, not every argument that's scientific is a scientific argument. I'm saying this is a field of argument. It's not a field of study. So I'm not saying we're talking about argument in the sciences. We're talking about the argumentative field of science, which basically says that if you're going to make a claim, you have to be able to present it in such a way that your evidence and your findings are open to the type of testable scrutiny that is the hallmark of the sciences. So again, this could take place any place. Just a minute ago, I was talking about jurisprudence in courts, right? In courts, you can definitely make a scientific argument. You can say, like, I have physical evidence or I have DNA evidence that either proves someone's guilt or proves someone's innocence. And if I introduce that into the court, it is examined in a scientific way. The argument there is not, oh, I'm a lawyer, I'm presenting scientific evidence, therefore it's jurisprudential evidence. No, it's scientific evidence, and the arguments in behalf of it are treated as if they're scientifically. And we could do that with anything in which fact-finding and data and evidence is going to be required. And lots of fields use that sort of thing, including, think about it, economics and psychology and marketing. We use data and we draw scientific inferential conclusions using data, right? Okay, so that's the field of science. Third field, ethics. Okay. Now, ethics isn't like law and science in that there isn't an ethics department in most universities. We study ethics as a subject. It's studied in philosophy, for example. But ethics is actually a field of argument, because one place where we go to have arguments is to just ask about whether or not somebody is doing something right or wrong, whether it's moral or immoral, whether they're outside the bounds and the norms, for example, in our society, or, for example, whether their religion or their base beliefs in a culture go against the thing that's being offered. So you can have an ethical argument in which, I guess basically what you do is you put up your standard, your ethical standard for an issue or a question, and then you decide, how is this issue going to be decided on ethical grounds? Okay? So ethics is another. Now, religion usually puts out a normative or prescriptive standard of ethics derived from its code of conduct. It could be scriptures or dogma. And so people can appeal to that as the basis on which to have the argument, whether or not something adheres or not to the standards laid out. But we can also do ethical things that completely come from subjective or humanistic sources. We can decide, for example, that our university is going to adopt a code of conduct, and we're writing it. It's not coming from a religious standpoint. And then again, the question would be, did somebody do something wrong by doing such and such? So that's another one. Next field, aesthetics. Aesthetics is actually a branch of philosophy that has to do with beauty and why people find things beautiful or tasteful or attractive. So aesthetics has to do with all the personal choices that we make as human beings for things that please us. The food we eat, the movies we like, the music we like, whether we find somebody physically attractive. Aesthetics is a response to the things that are in the world that are truly beautiful. They could be things in nature. They could be things that are created, like art and architecture. And we have arguments about that all the time. I mean, think about it. Let's say you saw a movie and you liked it, and then you told your friend, and your friend said, well, that movie stunk. And then you're all of a sudden in an argument. And it's an aesthetic argument because you're not going to use science or law or even ethics to decide whether that's a good movie. You're going to use the standards of aesthetics. And the standards of aesthetics are a lot like what I was talking about before when I was talking about the humanities. They shift and change over time, and people have different standards based on, what they like. So you could decide, for example, that a movie's great because it's popular, but somebody might say, well, does that prove it's good? Again, this is the kind of arguments we have on aesthetic grounds. And we really can have these arguments, and we really can express rational preferences for one thing over another. Like we could say, I like Beethoven more than I like Vanilla Ice or something like that. But you can justify these choices. Final field, politics. Now, the politics field, again, we're not just talking about the arguments that politicians make or necessarily the venues in which politics takes place. We're talking about a style or a type or a field of argument in which the decision is argued or made politically. And by that, I mean, we're focused on expediency. Expediency is the term to describe what politicians do, but not just politicians do this. When you have to make a decision because you have to make it now, because something's urgent, because it's a crisis, because it's a need, because we're looking at the immediate future, but also a little further out and about what do we need to be safe, to be happy, to be healthy, to be on a sound economic footing. We make these questions by looking at expediency, getting them done, getting them passed. It involves inevitably things like compromise, or even can involve self-delusion. You could end up saying things like, well, that doesn't really matter as long as I have a job. Okay? So that's politics. And again, those are your 5 disciplines. That's all of them. Jurisprudence or law, science, ethics, aesthetics, and politics. All the arguments in the world are in these categories. If you think about it, there really isn't any other category you have to go to have one of these arguments. So, all the fields that I was talking about before in the university, all the subjects that we teach, really are just 5 fields when you think about it, or make arguments in 5 ways. Okay? All right, so let's look at some examples. And the examples I want to look at, rather than just to say, this is an example of an argument in such and such a field, I want to talk about a phenomenon that's called field jumping. That's where I'm having an argument with you. It's in one of these fields. It's pretty obviously in one of these fields. But then I have to jump to another field to actually have the argument. Let's take a look. Here's the first one, justice to science. Okay, so in a little bit I'm going to share with you a documentary film, which I'm going to have you watch. And it's about a trial that took place in Pennsylvania where the school board had, in addition to the biology that taught evolution, they had added in some creation science into the curriculum to go alongside that. And a couple of the parents weren't excited about that because they thought that was an attempt to inject religious dogma into a science classroom in a public school. So they sued the school system. And this went all the way up to a federal judge as a constitutional question. So they had the trial, and the trial was really interesting because as soon as it began, you could see the question wasn't the question of, is it constitutional to teach creation science in a public school? The question became, what's science? So almost the whole trial was about whether or not the subject that the creationists wanted to teach in the high school curriculum was in fact a scientific subject. And as a result, the whole trial was a trial about what science is, and scientists had to testify, and they had to introduce scientific evidence. And when you watch it, you'll see there's scientists on the stand explaining what science is, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody was really explaining why they put the other thing in the curriculum. They were just explaining what science is and what that other thing was compared with science, or whether it's not science. So that's an interesting example of a field jump. Another field jump. So this is my man O.J. Simpson, who was tried for murder back in the 90s. And you guys are all too young, you don't remember, but this was a trial that went on for months and months and months and months and months. And at the end of the trial, people were saying that the jury would take forever to decide this because they had been forced to listen to evidence testimony for almost a whole year. And how could they get through all that stuff unless they took almost another year to go through every piece of evidence? And I think it was like a record. They came back in a couple hours with a verdict and they acquitted him. And of course, I think what must have happened was somebody in that room said, hey, we're never going to agree on this. I can tell you even before we start. And if we don't agree, it means we just spent a whole year having a trial for nothing. And we don't think that's really an outcome that's desirable for this trial. So if those of you who think he's guilty, who are never going to convince those of us who don't think he's guilty to vote, would go along with us and just say we're not unanimous and report that back as a not guilty, we can have the expedient action of getting this trial over with. It's just as good a theory what happened as anything else because nobody can explain it better. And of course, to avoid all the potential race riots that were being talked about as a result of it, maybe that was a legitimate decision. Maybe they were thinking in a larger sense expediently of having an outcome that would not create turbulence or unrest within the society. Next, a field jump from justice to aesthetics. So this is, of course, Kamala Harris. She was running for president till a few months ago. And at one point, you'll notice the or the flag behind her. She was the Attorney General of the state of California, and which is a big job, by the way. At one time during a fundraiser in California, President Obama was speaking to her and was talking about what an effective prosecutor she was, and also said, and I think Obama should have probably been spanked hard for saying this, that she was the most attractive prosecutor in the United States. Shame on you, Obama. But anyway, when he said that, it made me think, would that even be relevant to anything that we could talk about with a prosecutor, whether they're attractive or not? And then I thought back to some research that I did when I was in graduate school. I used to go to court and watch lawyers argue. Then I would see the outcomes of the case, and then sometimes I would have a chance to talk to the juries about how they voted and why. And I saw this one case where it was pretty clear to me that the prosecutor had won the case, that the guy was guilty and he had a good case and there wasn't really any doubt about it and so forth. And yet they acquitted the guy. So I was just curious beyond belief. And I was talking to people on the jury. And somebody on the jury said that they felt that the prosecutor was very obnoxious. They didn't like the way he dressed. They didn't like his ties. They didn't like the way that he was very flashy and that he greased his hair. And they just had a really bad vibe about him. And it was almost as if the filter of him looking and acting that way completely eliminated their desire or need to listen to what he was saying, which is your job as a juror, to listen to what's being said. So I was scratching my head and I said, wow, somebody got off on a serious crime because they didn't like the way the attorney looked. But it's funny because a couple years ago, I was serving on jury duty and I was in a voir dire. If you know what a voir dire is, where they're asking you questions about whether you should be on the jury. And the guy that was asking me these questions, he was a prosecutor. He was so annoying. He was such a, I don't even know how to describe it, that I actually was going to, if they had picked me for the jury, I was actually going to ask the judge if I could be excused because I wasn't sure that I could listen to that guy and be fair because he was annoying me so much. The thing that really bothered me about me was he was talking to me like I was a second grader. And I just don't think that's an appropriate way to talk to adults on a jury. But anyway, but it made me think that how a prosecutor looks and acts and dresses, that they look like they're well off because they're winning a lot of cases, I guess that has an influence on people. Science to politics. So, of course, we have global warming going on now, and I know that there's different political views of that, but it's interesting because the way that gets argued is not to look at it scientifically, but to look at it politically. So I've often heard, and this isn't a criticism of Republicans, but it's an argument that they make. I've often heard Republicans say, well, even if global warming is true, we would have to spend so much money to deal with it that it would hurt our economy. And I don't believe that it's politically expedient to hurt our economy. I'd rather have a healthy economy and deal with the consequences of that later, which I don't think is a good argument, but it shows how they don't want to have that argument as a scientist would have it. They want to have it as a politician would have it. What do we need to do about that? Well, their view is nothing. The other side's view is they have to do a lot and fast, and it has to be extreme. That's also an expediency argument. It's not a scientific argument. The scientists are presenting the information. What to do about it? All different ways to interpret that. I mean, for example, right now we're experiencing a virus, right? And activity around the world is shutting down. People are driving less. They're not going to work. They're not operating factories. There's going to be a gigantic drop in the emissions that we're creating. This is what the Republicans have in mind when they see this as a political issue. The only way to curb this activity is to have people not work, because that's what's going on now. And you'll probably see some kind of drop. I don't know if they can measure it month to month. You'll probably see a drop in greenhouse gases in this month, if they can measure it month by month, unless it just goes into the aggregate. I don't know. Last jump, ethics to politics. So think, what is one of the greatest ethical, moral issues of our time? Abortion, a woman's right to choose, or a child's right to life. Okay? So we could have that argument forever. It's a philosophical argument, it's a religious argument, it's a moral argument. We can have it in any venue or any context that you want. But the fact of the matter is, it's almost always decided as a political argument. People say, I'm going to vote for this candidate because he's going to pick this judge who's pro-life, and there's the chance that that side of that argument will win. But they won't make the argument because of the following moral justifications. Those issues have already been decided in another venue of argument. The only issue then becomes the political one. And notice when abortion is argued politically rather than ethically, then it comes to what are the limits of the politics or the expediency. For example, is it absolute? Or is it where the life of a mother is threatened? Or where it's a dangerous pregnancy to the child or the mother or both? Or does it involve things like screening and how late is too late and what are the exceptions? Rape and incest, is that an exception? So these are simply political questions. In an absolute moral issue, it's open and shut. There aren't these gradations of the morals of it. So that's when it gets decided. So think about that. There's lots of places where you have an argument in one place and it shifts somewhere else, right? Or I'm going to say, hey, let's decide it by this. I guess, for example, in aesthetics, if I wanted to test people when they went to the movies by putting little sensors on their hands where they put their hands in the movie theater to see how their galvanic skin response changes when the movie, I could say I have the scientific data that a movie's good and argue that there's a shift. But then ultimately the question is, do we accept that that's a reason why a movie's good because of the physical responses that we arouse in people from watching them? I don't know. But they are definitely distinct argument fields. Okay, so that wraps up today's lecture. And again, keep in touch. Let me know if you have any problems watching this video. Take care.